First, let's begin with materials. This is wood. Wood is good. I'm sure you've seen it before. It comes from a tree. Trees are also beautiful. Sometimes I'm saddened that a tree had to die in order for me to receive its gifts, but then I'm reminded that wood is a renewable resource and it will all return to dust and trees again in the future. Now bear with me, I'm going to talk about the anatomy of a tree. You may ask yourself why this is important, and for some woodworkers it's probably not. I think if you're a wood turner, it's definitely good to understand this. This is sapwood. It is the outermost ring of a tree. It's the part that's still alive. It's generally lighter in color, but not always. Heartwood is the inner portion of the tree, and it's generally darker in color, but again, not always. At the very center of the tree is the pith. Some heartwoods and sapwoods are prized for their unique colors and can be vastly different in coloration, even if the wood is from the same tree. This is the bole of the tree, or as it's more commonly known, the trunk of the tree. This is bark. Generally, we don't use this. Unless, of course, we're talking about live edge wood. Live edge wood is great for tables and floating shelves. The difference between live edge and just another regular slab of wood is that the edge is made up of the outermost portion of the tree, so you can see the asymmetry of it. Some people cannot resist pouring resin on live edge wood. This is grain. Grain is formed, of course, from the changing of the seasons and the growth rings of the tree. There is generally two types of grain, face grain and end grain. Wood is made up of a straw-like structure. These straws run vertically up and down the length of the tree. End grain is the ends of these straws, and face grain is the side of these straws. Why do woodworkers and turners obsess over this? Well, for one, end grain is harder to work. The straws easily tear out, and we'll cover what that means later in techniques. This is a burl. Burls are beautiful. Just look at that crazy grain pattern. They are formed when the tree suffers an injury or disease, much the same way a scab is formed over a scraped knee. Some grain patterns are highly sought after for their beautiful appearance. Figured wood is a general catch-all term that refers to grain pattern that is highly pronounced. Let's go over some of those patterns. Curly maple looks like it sounds. Check that out. And then there's bird's eye, spalting, and finally ambrosia. Ambrosia actually being caused by insects and fungus. Something with such a pretty appearance, and might I add a beautiful name, from something so gross, huh? This is crotch wood. I know, it sounds obscene. But as you will come to find, woodworkers love to name things after human body parts. Crotch wood forms as the tree's branches bifurcate. It looks like two legs ending in, well, the stress and gravity of the branches extending out from the tree lead to some interesting grain patterns, though. All right, let's shift gears here and talk about how wood is processed. First, the wood is milled down. Well, actually, first, some lumberjack chops it down, but then it's milled. Milling is the industrial processing of wood, basically getting it into smaller, more manageable pieces. The way wood is prepared can vary. Why should you care? Well, depending on how wood is milled can change its properties. Wood can be quarter sawn, that is, divided into 4 sections, quarters, in a splayed, circular, radial pattern. Plain sawn, or flat sawn as it's called, is what you will see people doing when they use a chainsaw mill, which we'll cover in tools. Because this is the easiest method, it is also the cheapest. Those beautiful slabs of live edge wood you see are generally cut this way. Rift sawn is pretty close to quarter sawn, but select pieces of wood are used for this method. If you were to stand a board up on its sides, you would see that the rift sawn grain runs perfectly straight from left to right. This method is wasteful if the pieces in between are not used. Thus, it tends to be the most expensive. It's kind of like getting the choice cuts of beef. It leads to the most stable type of wood, making it very desirable for projects such as furniture, though. Wood can be green, meaning it's not been dried out. Yes, wood is full of moisture. You can measure the moisture content of wood with a digital moisture meter. Wood can also be kiln drying, placed in a large oven and carefully heated to remove the moisture. Or it can be air dried, placed on stickers, which are thin strips of wood that create space between the slabs, and basically allowing air to flow over it and dry it out. Wood can warp, and I don't mean it can teleport. Sorry, couldn't resist. Rather, wood can distort from its original intended shape in several ways, including cupping and bowing or twisting. This is because of moisture. Wood is never quite inert. Woodworkers will talk about seasonal movement. As the moisture level in the air changes, so too does the structure of wood. In kiln-dried and finished wood, this movement is less pronounced, almost imperceptible, but it's never quite gone. All right, let's talk about some of the types of wood. Dimensional lumber refers to wood that has been milled up with all its sides jointed and planed. Don't worry, we'll be covering jointing and planing in techniques and tools. You're probably familiar with dimensional lumber. Most big box stores sell it, of the softwood variety, mainly pressure treated pine. You probably have also heard of 2x4s and 4x4s. This is the terminology for the nominal width and thickness of the wood, 2 inches by 4 inches and 4 inches by 4 inches. What does nominal mean? Well, in this context, it means that it's not the actual inches because of shrinkage, standards, traditions, and blah, blah, blah. Interestingly enough, there's a lawsuit right now to challenge how big box stores label wood. When you buy wood at a lumber yard, and I mean an honest-to-goodness lumber yard, not one of those things attached to a big box store, they will measure it out in quarters of an inch. So if you see 4/4, it's actually referring to 4/4 of an inch, or rather 1 inch, while 8/4 is actually 2 inches thick. And confusingly, this is much closer to the true measurement, plus or minus a little, unlike big box lumber. Weird, right? When you buy wood at a lumber dealer and not a big box store, they sell it by the board foot. A board foot is a standard unit of measurement equivalent to a hypothetical board that is 1 inch thick by 12 inches long by 12 inches wide. In other words, 144 cubic inches if you're a math nerd. Don't worry, there's a phone app that will help you calculate how many board feet your board is when in doubt. Going to a wood seller and not a big box store can definitely be intimidating, as it's a vastly different experience. But the people that work there are usually always very friendly and willing to help. Wood is also graded with an elaborate system which is far too in-depth for the scope of this video. But generally, the grading refers to the strength and how clear the wood is. Clear meaning wood that's without defects or knots. And this is what they mean by a knot, in case you're wondering. My recommendation is not to sweat the wood grading system. However, and I cannot stress this enough, carefully inspect each board that you buy. Look for checking, that is cracking that forms in wood that isn't properly dried, and also make sure the board is straight and flat. I know, obvious, right? You may have asked yourself, why don't we see wood that is much thicker? Trees, after all, are many inches thick, right? Okay, maybe you probably never thought to ask that question. But the reason is that drying lumber that thick is prohibitively expensive. Oh man, I feel like that last paragraph deserves at least a few.
Hey, that's what she said.
The problem with showing that clip is now you're going to be thinking about this through the rest of the video. There's so many opportunities. But please, try to be mature. All right, let's talk about hardwood.
That's what she said.
Hardwood is not always harder than softwoods like pine and fir. The true differentiator between hardwood and softwood is actually the fact that softwoods have pine cones. Who knew? Hardwoods do grow slower, but they're often actually nicer on your tools than some softwoods. The hardness of wood is measured on a scale called the Yanka scale. Funny story, I had originally thought that Yanka was pronounced as Janka and had a pun about janky, but the inventor of this scale was Gabriel Yanka. an Austrian-born fellow. And just like the names Jan and Johann, I'm pretty sure that the Yanka is pronounced like a Y. Yanka is measured by taking a steel ball bearing and pushing it into the wood and measuring the force it takes to make an indent. I believe the steel ball bearing has to go at least halfway into the wood. The hardest wood on record is called cabracho, which roughly translates into axe breaker, with an impressive 4,570 pounds of force, or 20,340 Newton Yanka rating. The softest wood is balsa, with a puny 70 pounds of force, or 330 Newton rating. Okay, so there's two types of wood. There's domestic lumber, and in the States, and apologies in advance for my ethnocentricity, this consists of mainstays like maple, oak, cherry, and walnut. And then there's exotic woods, lumber not grown in your country of origin. And again, for the States, this is things like padauk, purple heart, and zebrawood. Exotic woods are much more expensive. For reference, zebrawood can sell for $25 a board foot, while maple might only cost you $4 a board foot. So what do they mean when they talk about blanks and stock? Stock is a term most used by woodworkers when talking about a milled but not final cut piece of wood. After all that milling occurs, woodworkers will further modify it themselves, kind of like their whole thing, you know. Meanwhile, a blank is much the same thing, but generally it refers to wood turning wood instead. And there's a whole slew of different types of turning blanks. They generally refer to the object in which the wood will become. For example, bowl blanks, pen blanks, spindle blanks, and platter blanks. Confusingly, they call a knife handle blank a scale. Not sure why. So what's the difference between timber and lumber? Well, in the US, timber is a cut tree that has not been milled up yet, whereas lumber is usually milled. These terms are supposedly different outside the US. Okay, we've covered a lot of the ins and outs of wood. That's what she said. Tired yet? Confused? Overwhelmed? Don't worry, that's natural. Don't forget, I have an index, so you can come back and reference any of these topics already covered and skip right to them with a timestamp on the video. So now let's talk about some unnatural materials that woodworkers use. There is MDF, or medium density fiberboard. This stuff is actually wood fibers and glue compacted together through heat and pressure. It's tough on tools since the glue is dulling to blades, but it's great in that it does not shift due to seasonal moisture. But if it does become soaking wet, it's certainly going to swell up like a balloon. It's also annoying in that you can't really plane it, which is generally not an issue because it comes pre-planed, nor work it well with hand tools. Again, not really its purpose. And it's been said that it contains harmful chemicals, formaldehydes, that are released when cutting. I don't like to use it too much, but it does have some very important applications. Like if you're trying to make a shooting board and you want a perfectly stable piece of wood, MDF is perfect. This is plywood. Plywood is layered, laminated sheets of wood and glue with the grain in alternating directions on each layer for added stability and strength. I think it's a little bit more eye-pleasing than MDF. What do you think? It too is also very stable and comes in huge 8 foot by 4 foot sheets. Again, not the actual size because of standards, blah, blah, blah. It's nice because outside of very old trees, wood doesn't generally grow 4 feet wide. Baltic birch plywood is considered some of the best of these types of plywood in its relative beauty. Speaking of which, there is furniture grade plywood, and then there's the stuff you hide behind drywall. One last material that I will cover. And I'm aware that woodworkers often dip into other materials, such as metals and acrylics. But if you've tuned into recent trends in wood turning and woodworking, you might have heard of resin. There's epoxy resin waterfall tables, resin hybrid blanks, all the rage. Epoxy is mixed in 2 parts. There's a hardener and the resin itself. They are stored in separate containers until ready for use, at which point they are thoroughly, can't stress that word enough, thoroughly mixed. check out Zach Higgins' channel for oodles of info on resin. Okay, that was the first installment on materials. Wasn't so bad, was it? Next, we're going to talk about tools. So stay tuned for that video.